Hi, my name is Mark Zeckley. I'm a partner and economist with the firm Columbia Pacific Consulting. Most of the work that I do and my firm does involves providing calculations to assist in civil litigation matters that involve personal injury or fatality. One of the common tasks that we're asked to deal with is to estimate the present value of future costs that are recommended by an occupational therapist or other life planner. Today I'm going to be talking about a tool. The tool is called CostPV, and the purpose of the tool is to provide life care planners or lawyers or insurers with a simple interface that they can use to estimate the present value of specific future costs. So the cost PV framework includes two components that work hand in hand together. The first is the Excel workbook, which we'll get to in a minute. And the second is an online app that interacts with the workbook in order to provide a present value. So let's first of all look at where we get the app, and then we'll move on to give a sample estimate of the present value of some specific costs. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the CostPV website. The URL is shown to my left here. It's costpv.columbiapacific or cpconsulting.com. And from that website, you can scroll down. And if I scroll down, there's a section that says Get the Workbook. And I'm going to click on Download. And it will try to open up in the online version of Excel. That will not work. You'll need to download the file. I see a little blue button at the top that lets me do that. So I'm going to click on the download button. You might notice that in File Explorer, there's now a new item that magically appeared. It's the CostPV Excel workbook. What I'll now do is I'm going to open up the CostPV Excel workbook, and that will should open up in my Excel. We'll just give it a minute so that there we go. Okay, so now we're looking at Excel. The first thing that I'm going to do before going any further is to increase the font size so everybody can see properly. Hopefully that makes it easier. So now we have the CostPV Excel workbook in front of us. We do have to enable editing before we can do anything. And we also have to enable the content as well for it to interact with the CostPV online app. So the upper portion of the workbook does contain some general inputs, which we'll talk about in a minute. The lower portion includes specific costs. You'll see that the workbook is currently populated with some sample costs. Those can be deleted. Why don't we do that right now? And we'll start fresh. In the right-hand pane, there's also an area that will give us feedback just to see whether we're entering the costs as intended or not. We'll see how that all works in a minute. So looking at the upper section of the workbook, in this area we do have some location-specific variables. So in British Columbia, where I do most of my work, the our system has two taxes that could potentially apply to an item. There's a goods and services tax, or GST, that's set at 5%. And then secondly, there's a provincial sales tax, or PST, which is 7%. So I would have it set like this for British Columbia. In other jurisdictions, there might be different tax rates. So let's change this. Let's suppose that we're doing a calculation for the province of Ontario. So in Ontario, there's what's called a harmonized sales tax, and that rate is 13%. And there is no provincial sales tax. So I'm just going to type in NA, and I'll set the tax rate to 0. The other location-specific variables that we might want to change are the discount rate. So the discount rate refers to the time value of money. It's the rate at which the award is assumed to be invested in order to provide for the costs that are needed in the future. In British Columbia, there's a statutory requirement to use a discount rate of 2%, which implies that the rate of return will be 2% above the rate of price inflation. In other jurisdictions, the requirement could be different. So sticking with Ontario, the statutes require that we use a discount rate of 0% for the first 15 years and 2.5% for years 16 onward. So using this section here, I've set the discount rate as being 0% per year for 15 years and 2.5% for the date that starts 15 years from today. We now move to this area of the workbook where we can put in variables that are specific to the plaintiff who we are dealing with. So suppose that this is a 40-year-old Ontario male. Let's give him a birth date of April 17th, 1982. And suppose that this trial is proceeding on October 2nd, 2022. We've now told CostPV that we should be treating him as being a age 40.5. We also have to tell CostPV what mortality risks should be applied. And those are defined in life tables that you can choose from through the drop-down menu. So I'm going to scroll down this menu until I see 2017 to 19 life tables for Ontario males. So let's just use that one. And now it tells us that based on those life tables for a 40.5-year-old man, his life expectancy should be 41.4 remaining years to age 81.9, and that's shown right here. We're now ready to enter the specific costs that are needed. So in column A, we can describe items. We can also put in headings. So we might have a heading for medications. Medications, if it's a heading, won't have a cost attached to it, but under it, there might be certain medications. So we might have Tylenol. And Tylenol might have a cost of, let's say it's $25. I would enter that in column B. Some items are provided as a point estimate, others as a range. Suppose it's not $25, but suppose it's $25 to $35 per year. Then what I would do is I would keep $25 in this column, but I would enter $35 in column C. The next column over asks us about the first of the two taxes. Do we want to include it or do we not? And so in this case, let's suppose that we do want the HST to be added. I would type yes, add it. The second tax is not applicable because we told CostPV that we're only going to be concerning ourselves with one tax here. Replacement interval by default is assumed to be on an annual basis. So because this is a medication, Tylenol, we're going to assume that that's an annual cost. We're not going to put anything in columns F or G. Column H is the start date. Now, by default, the start date is assumed to be the date of trial, which is, in this case, October 2nd, 2022. If it's a item that's not required right away, but is required at some future date, we would enter that future date in column H. Column I is the end date. By default, the end date is taken to be the end of life. That's not always the case. Some items might be required, say, only to age 65 or only for 3 years, in which case we would type in the end date that's needed here. Let's put in a second medication just to show how that end date might apply. Suppose that this man had a pain syndrome, which it's expected will resolve in 5 years, but in the meantime, he needs pain medication. Well, that pain medication, let's give it a cost of $450 per year. Suppose that it's not a range, it's a point estimate. And so we'll leave that blank. It's a prescription medication, so we're not going to charge HST on it. The replacement interval, we can leave blank, meaning that it's an annual cost. Start date we'll leave blank because it's starting at trial, so the default works. The default, recall, is that the cost is going to be starting on the trial. However, the end date is going to be 5 years from now. This is where a handy Excel function called eDate could be used. So the eDate function has 2 parameters. First, you tell Excel what is the date that we're going to want to measure the intended date against. In this case, it's the trial date. So I would type in eDate. I'll type open brackets, and the date that we're measuring, we're finding this date relative to is going to be the trial date. And the second parameter is the number of months past, in this case, the trial date, that we want to have returned. So in this case, we're interested in a date that's 5 years past the trial date. So what I would do is I would type in 5 times 12, meaning that we're going to have 60 months. And sure enough, the date that it returns is October 2nd, 2027, and that's 5 years past the trial date. These 2 items are annual costs. There's no defined interval between the replacements. They're assumed to be continuous costs. Let's put in some equipment items where there might be a range of replacement frequencies. So I'll put in another heading here, and let's put in ice pack. So let's suppose that this man needs an ice pack every 2 to 3 years, costing $40. So I'll type in the price, which is $40. Let's assume that the HST does apply to that cost. The shorter replacement frequency is going to be 2 years. The longer replacement frequency is going to be 3 years. And it's going to start at trial, so I can leave this blank. And it's going to continue right through to the end of life, so I will leave that blank. And we've dealt with the ice pack. Suppose that he also needs a scooter, but maybe not right away. He might be fine for the first 10 years, but he's going to need a scooter 10 years from now, and that scooter is going to need replacement every 5 to 7 years. So let's say scooter, and we'll give it a price. Say it's $5,000, and the replacement frequency is going to be every 5 years to 7 years. Now, here's where we'd enter a start date. In this case, we want to have a date that's 10 years into the future. So we can use the eDate function to get that date. So I'll use equals eDate. I'll type in the trial date, and I'll say 10 times 12. And that gives us the date that's 10 years into the future. Hit enter, and sure enough, we get October 2nd, 2032. There might be some maintenance required for that scooter. Let's say it's $200 per year. We can leave all of the replacement interval variables blank because it's an annual cost, but I'm just going to copy the date that's 10 years into the future and start the maintenance expense on that same date. Let's suppose that there's some home-related costs, so housekeeping. And let's give it a name. We'll say that he needs help with snow removal. So I'll say snow removal. And suppose that that annual cost is $700. But let's assume that HST applies, but that it's only going to be required until, say, his 80th birthday, and that might be as an acknowledgement that it could have been required in any event. What I would do is I would use the eDate function to find his 80th birthday. eDate. Now, in this case, the eDate is not relative to the trial date anymore. It's relative to his birthday. So I'll type in eDate, and the first parameter will be BD, that's the birth date. Second parameter will be the number of months into the beyond the birth date that we're interested in. So I'll type 12 times 80. And we find that, or have this cost stopping on his 80th birthday at April 17th, 2062. And let's add one more item because there's one case I have not covered, and that's the case of a one-time cost. Suppose that there's, suppose to make things easier, he's going to need a scooter ramp, and that's going to be needed 10 years from now because that's when the scooter is going to be purchased. And suppose that ramp is going to cost $3,500. And what we'll do is I'm just going to copy the date that's 10 years from now, paste it in here. Scooter ramp is only going to be needed once. So the code to enter a one-time cost is a value of 111. The reason 111 works is that statistically speaking, nobody's going to live an extra 111 years because the life tables stop at age 110. So we now have all the costs entered. It's a good idea at this stage, before proceeding any further, to just review the summary of future costs to see that everything looks as intended. So what do we have here? We've got the Tylenol. That was a $25 to $35 annual costs from October 2nd, 2022 to the end of life. That looks good. And so we can move on. The pain medication was, again, an annual cost, $450 per year, but only for 5 years. That looks good. And so on. Once we're satisfied that the costs that are entered or the costs that were intended, we can press the Calculate Present Value button, and it will queue us and ask whether we want to enter CostPV online. So I'm going to say yes. So what I'm going to do now is move over to my internet browser. And in my internet browser, what's opened up is the CostPV online workbook. Not workbook, but the CostPV online app, pardon me. And from here, we can choose the input file. So this is the file that we've been working with on our computer. So that's the CostPV Excel workbook. I've been working within my downloads directory here. So I'll hit open. And once I've done that, there's a button here that says upload, which I'll click on. And the app tells me that CostPV Excel workbook.xlsm has been uploaded. I can then click on a button here that says generate PDF report. One little possible area where things can go sideways, the workbook or the tables that will be generated from CostPV do show up in separate windows, so they are pop-ups. So you'll have to enable pop-ups from the CostPV website for this to work for you. So when I clicked on that button, it says generating a PDF report can take several minutes, and it tells us to keep the browser tab open until it completes, and that 3 files will be generated. One is a multipliers table, the second is a calculation of the low end of costs, and the third is a calculation of the high end of costs. Are you sure you want to continue? I'm going to click yes. And in a few seconds, CostPV should come back with some tables. There we go. So the first table that we'll look at is the multipliers table. And so this is a multiplier applicable to every $1,000 of annual costs of future care. The leftmost column defines the interval. Then we show what the age is for every interval. The cost is assumed to be $1,000 per year. We then show the survival at the start of the interval. So this is the probability of being alive. Of course, it's 100% on the trial date, but as we go on in time, that probability drops to 0. We then show what discount rate has been specified. In this case, I specified a discount rate of 0% for the first 15 years and 2.5% thereafter. The discount rate that's shown in this column is measured as of the start of each interval, which is also true with the survival rates. The adjusted cost is shown for each interval in the second to rightmost column, and then finally in the right-hand column, it shows what the present value would be up until the end of each interval. So if we had $1,000 that starts on the trial date and continues on right through to the end of this man's life, the present value of that would be $33,418. If it's for a shorter period, then the multiplier will be lower, of course. So if the cost of $1,000 is assumed to continue no later than age 65, then the multiplier to age 65 would be $22,745. I'm going to move on to the second of the 3 tables, and this is the calculation of the present value at the lower end of the specified costs. So what we have here is the same list of costs that we already entered, starting with medications, and those were the Tylenol and the pain medications, and then the equipment items, and then the housekeeping. For each item, what we see in column B is the replacement frequency and the time frame. Now, when it's the lower end of costs, we're looking at the the least frequent replacement. So for example, you'll recall when we entered the data for the ice pack, we set it to every 2 to 3 years. When we're calculating the lower end of costs for the ice pack, we take the 3-year interval between replacements. Taking all of the lower end of costs, what we find is that the present value of future costs would be $55,336. Now, there's a final table, and this is very similar to the last one we just looked at. It's dealing with the high end of the specified range. So in the case of the ice pack, for example, we took, instead of every 3 years, it's assumed to be required every 2 years. And for all of the costs, we assumed the upper end of the range that we had entered into the Excel workbook. If we take all of the higher costs, then the present value works out to $62,745. That concludes my presentation on the CostPV workbook. I hope you found this interesting, and that you'll also use and enjoy the tool. If you had any feedback or wanted to get in touch with me, my contact information can be found through the website, which is going to be provided to you in the next slide. So thank you for watching, and enjoy the tool.